Good morning, everyone. It's so sad not to be in Durham, missing the presentations, the energy, the conversations about a topic that means so much to me is tough. But huge thanks to Douglas and Georgina, also to Johanna and Dorothy for pulling this together and making me feel like part of it, even from a distance. I'll share some thoughts on closure from where I am. So, it's likely that each of us understands more about closure than we can articulate. We can easily discuss closure as an experience or as a theoretical concept. However, I believe many of us share a sense of frustration about aspects of closure that we haven't or we couldn't quite put into words. A sense of closure might be tied to something fundamental in our lives, way beyond its theoretical interpretations. Do we find ourselves in open-ended situations, or are we on a predetermined path? Is our life becoming or just unfolding? Assessment of meaning and purpose behind our lives, behind our choices, our actions, is explicitly or implicitly related to closure. And what better place to dive into this than here at Durham at the Center for Death and Life Studies. So as I lay in bed thinking about this presentation, I revisited some classic grief literature and did some rereading of Freud and Bobby here, but also Strube in class. I also do in a couple of recent conversations with Romanian psychotherapists, but most importantly, I wanted to bring into this conversation the concept of closure in the topological semantics of modal logic, which I recently discussed with a Paris-based Romanian logician and pianist Andrei Vieru. And here's his book. Just one moment. In Romanian, In Praise of Boundaries. And secondly, the link between closure and narrative was also important for this presentation, and this link was inspired by the insights of the American Slavist and literary critic Gary Solmorson, mostly from his well-known book Narrative and Freedom, The Shadows of Time. Discussing closure outside the realm of grief studies isn't meant to complicate things further, but rather to help us access something perhaps more fundamental by introducing two elements: temporality and freedom. Okay, so I'll explore three dimensions of closure. For clarity, I'll discuss them separately, but they're obviously intertwined. From each dimension, I'll pull out some insights to inform my conclusion, but I won't go as deep into each one. I'll focus on specific aspects. And, my very broad question is, can we undogmatize closure without fully deconstructing it? Because the real challenge isn't so much about conceptualizing closure, but how to prevent ourselves from over-conceptualizing it. So the raw closure, the one that isn't about healing process or meaning making, the raw closure is actually the act of closing, and it prompts us to think about separations, distinctions, boundaries, contours. And also from an agent's perspective, it involves purpose, choices, decisions. And with this idea in mind, here are the three dimensions I will try to look at. First, the human dimension of closure, then a cultural dimension of closure, breaking it down into two sub-dimensions, rituals and narrativity. And finally, I'll consider closure as a theoretical construct, touching on grief models and how topological semantics of modal logic can provide fresh insights into understanding closure. But first things first, the human dimension. Well, certainly there's no such thing as the truth on closure. But we can still ask, is there a bare sense of closure? And if yes, could it be related to temporality? I mean, we traverse time with a sense of purpose and direction. And in a way, human life itself embodies closure as time is unidirectional. We reflect on our past, we peer into the future, and as long as the future is partially shaped by what we think, feel, and do in the present, we found ourselves waiting for, and not only waiting, but also being entitled to a sense of completion. We contour our experiences and we stabilize them in a biography. And this is close to what we know from Eric Erickson's view on personal identity. I mean, linking inner time and outer time, getting a sense of who we are while we go through turning points, through thresholds, transitions, crises. And there is this rhythm to it because life isn't just a series of add ons, right? So we move through time with intention, crafting a path lined with meaning that guide us forward. So we may have an actual mental orientation towards completion, which is not simply an emotional experience or an intellectual conception of time, but simply the banality that we are engaged with time as we live. We add cultural and theoretical fortifications to a sense of time. And as we go about in a world and we do stuff and meet other people, there is also a sense of timing. A sense of time becomes a sense of timing, and there's this rhythm that allows us to see a pattern, a theme, a melody, a soundtrack of our life. And this is, I would say, the urge to have our life, to map it as a journey. And I know you hate this, at least some of you, but you can't really erase the idea of a journey from the human mind, can you? Because it's inseparable from the idea of experience. And this becomes more evident as we age, living to tell the tale, right? And this is Garcia Marquez. So the arrow of time, time's directionality, guides experiences towards some closure, or at least an end state. Of course, there are many modes of understanding time and space, and then there's this vast diversity of private time. But who can contradict Gary Morson's saying, time and people are not infinitely malleable? Yes, the experience and the perception of time vary from person to person, but temporality is the very structure of existence. And just a very quick thing about our digital present. There's no such thing as unidirectional digital journey, right? So it's a mosaic of past, present, and future. Click on, click back, return to the previous page. So in the digital realm, there's no closure or hyperclosure because there's never a final destination or a final site, a final website. Okay, so this is about time, and now about the cultural dimension of closure. Culture and traditions are essential in how we live, but even more so in how we confront death. We think globally when we pick a holiday destination or a music playlist, but not so much when a parent dies. So, in a recent article, I argued we need not only acknowledge this cultural and historical contingency, but also develop global methodologies to address it. I've divided this part into two subdimensions, ritual and narrativity. And first, I will share some technical insights about ritual, and then, without going into too many cultural nuances of breaking or keeping bonds, I'll offer some illustrations from Romanian deaf culture. But first, ritual. I won't discuss the theories of ritual. I'm sure Johanna discussed Turner and perhaps Dothe, if she talked about ritual creativity, also covered the ground. So as far as I'm concerned, instead of labeling rituals as symbolic or emotional or cathartic or performative or formal or communicative or secular or individual, I'll emphasize that all rituals carry intention. Even minimal rituals require at least a half conscious intention. And Catherine Bells beautifully writes that ritualization is a way of acting designed and orchestrated to distinguish what is being done from other doings. And this is, in my view, an act of contouring, of setting aside, of choosing, of privileging. So when Bell suggests that we possess a sense of ritual, I feel there's some overlapping here with a sense of closure. She defines ritualization as the very drawing in and through the activity itself of a privileged distinction. So, in my view, rituals themselves are acts of contouring. And please keep this in mind because I'll need it later. Um, Now, just a few things about closure in Romanian deaf culture that might interest you. Communal ties and rituals are the bedrock of our still rather traditional deaf culture. So, the extended family has to manage death ceremonially, logistically, emotionally. Emotional withdrawal at an early stage of dying is often desired. It's common to have a neighbor, for instance, rather than a family member sit at the bedside of a dying person, which is believed to facilitate a quicker, more peaceful passing. And this practice may seem harsh to Westerner, but it remains culturally acceptable here and even logical. Also, in the West, when we say closure, we think about an individual response to grief, but in collective societies, closure also has a communal dimension. It has nothing to do with psychological wellness, but with afterlife beliefs, orthodox beliefs. So the death ritual journey lasts up to 7 years, even 10, which enables us to have these sets of rituals that mark a specific kind of closure. There are these established liminal periods which allow ambiguity and also restoration. We can call it a serial closure, always designed as a journey, marking the passing of the soul through various celestial customs. And what's to be noted is that there is this vast, reassuring structure spreading across many years that is designed to regulate and to contour the changing shape of the bond. To contour it, not to break it. The dead are kept at a distance and also remembered, and there's a certain collective pressure to adhere to these rituals. Now, what about the individual level? Usually, after a year of mourning, individuals are expected to stop wearing black, accept their loss, and return to normal life as rituals continue. And this is a soft kind of closure, right? Rather than a stark endpoint. And it's about finding your rhythm within this supporting bigger structure. And you can see this a controlled transition from one chapter to the next. Of course, that beneath these formal practices, there's always a lot of personal mess, right? And over the past 3 years, I've spoken with many who've been through grief, and I've experienced it myself last year. Reality is that after 12 months, family pressure to move on becomes palpable, often motivated by practicalities like selling a home or settling inheritance issues. Actually, family offers little room for creative grieving, and in the circles of friends, there is an expectation to move forward. Grievers themselves actively seek resolution because they see it as being realistic. Of course, they still perform personal rituals like visiting places or preparing favorite meals, but the intensity of grief is expected to diminish, and it actually does. And this is openly acknowledged. Even parents who have lost a child gradually try to go back to normalcy. There are perhaps episodes of depression, but then they seek comfort in familiar routines. They return to their favorite Netflix series, and so what's implied or even verbalized directly is this: there is a time to cry and then a time not to cry. Okay, so now the narrative. Um, Now, rituals may lack explicit narratives, but there are cultural models of making beginnings and endings count. Birth, love, death, time. When we have something with a recognizable beginning and a recognizable end, we usually call it a story. And in storytelling, we don't simply transition from one state to another. There's structure and there's a perspective and there is character development. There are no loose ends, there are no redundancies. And as you probably know, the Russian literary critic Mikhail Bakhtin introduced the concept of chronotope, which is the intrinsic connection between time and space in literary works. The story is given, but also in the making, uh, like some kind of guided openness reflected in the creative process itself, I mean, in the act of writing, but also in the experience of reading. A good story captures the complexities of real life experiences, the complex human interactions. Characters have agency, they experience time as being open, they make decisions, they resolve conflicts and uncertainties. So for me as a reader to explore this rich freedom, the author must first have it for himself or herself. So the courage of artistic freedom is not to find the perfect ending or leave the novel or the symphony simply unfinished, but with the right means of expression to manage to avoid creating ready-made worlds. In good works of art, the sense of possibility remains intact. Bakhtin went as far as saying that chronotopes are crucial not just for representing stories, but actually for making representation possible. So we can say that narrative reconstructs experience, and in turn, experience shapes the stories we tell. About, I think, 6 years ago, I tried to explore this through 5 interviews with very aged widows and widowers focused on forgiveness, something many struggled to grant. For the elderly, achieving closure regarding their relationships with a spouse, with their children, seemed fundamental. Questions like, did they care about me or what was I to them, are deeply painful when left unresolved. And I considered here gerontologist Robert Butler's concept of life review and realized that although we always have this sense of being unfinished, we're just as marked by the fact that we're finite beings in finite relationships. And we have this tendency of mapping ourselves in relation to beloved others to figure out perhaps not this story, but a story. And this narrative mapping depends on imagining alternatives and keeping this tension between closure and openness alive. So narratives raise questions about how free or unfree we feel and how closed or open we think we are, and they're definitely more than aesthetic forms. They're profound tools for understanding human experience. And what I realized is that no story offers certainties, not even founding myths do that. They show a path without explaining it. Only ideologies explain everything. And closure is not explanatory. It's not about offering solutions because there's this narrativeness about closure. Closure is not about answering riddles, but about contouring experiences. And that's what stories do. Okay, so now let's go to some serious business. Grief theories. I'm sure Dorothy has covered much of this already and much better than I could. So, just to summarize for the sake of coherence of this speech, there's a wide range of grief cultures, but clinical and theoretical traditions aren't that many, right? Some from Freud's Mourning and Melancholia, who framed detaching from the lost object as the healthy path forward. Closure has become a psychological task, the famous grief work. Refusal of closure leads to what was persistently termed complicated grief. And a century later, most therapists still expect their grieving patients to achieve this kind of closure. However, what I observed in Romanian therapeutic environment, psychiatrists hesitate to diagnose complicated grief because they know reality is complicated. Everybody knows that. So, in and out of therapy rooms, ambivalence and intricacies of grief are widely accepted, perhaps across cultures. So, grief has been gradually depathologized, even in the West. We saw this shift towards the continuing bonds model in the mid 90s, which was well received until it wasn't. But fortunately, contemporary grief scholarship is more nuanced, and there are strong voices, and Dorothy is one of them, recognizing the danger of overexposing certain grief norms or stereotypes or canons. In fact, when social scientists feel they should mainly derive their knowledge from abstract theories rather than concrete experiences, we end up stuck. We end up distracted from what we really observe. And the problem is when people grieve, their perception of loss is less informed by genuine attention to their own experience of suffering and more from what influencers or therapists or scholars say. And there's a lot of learned ignorance here, and I've experienced it myself. It was disturbing to realize that the ties with my deceased friend were not by default aligned to reduce damage. Still, I'm not ready to dismiss closure as a myth. It's too timeless and too fundamental to the human experience to lack wisdom. But perhaps we can reframe it less dogmatically, and the topological semantics of moral logic can help us change the angle a bit, because here closure takes a slightly different meaning. So, from what I understand, what moral logic does is to extend classical logic to include modalities. So, concepts like necessity and possibility in human actions are also considered. You just don't evaluate statements for their truth value, but also in terms of different possible scenarios, how decisions are shaped, what's permissible, what's necessary, what's obligatory. We discuss it as we discussed it in the narrative section. I mean, to understand an event or to understand the personal choice, we, we should be able to imagine other options, what ifs might have been. Or now, uh, in topology, closure encompasses all points of a set along with its limit points. The clear boundaries that define special relationships. And with the topological semantics of model logic developed by Alfred Tarski, we have a way of interpreting moral propositions through the framework of topology. So, possible scenarios are represented as points in a topological space. And what's emphasized is that the realm of possibility corresponds to the topological closure and can be spatially interpreted as the boundary operator, which is an infinitely narrow space, a boundary. And that's what André Vieira uses to substantiate the representation of freedom as a completion. That means as a closure, not as a removal of boundaries, not as openness. Basically, Vieira says that closure makes freedom possible, and freedom is thus a frontier. And he gives the example, as you can see, of a cyclist riding hands free with a deep sense of agency and control. So, boundaries provide the necessary structure that allows freedom to be expressed. Remove the boundaries in case of some absolute openness, and you lose your freedom. I mean, the very possibility of choice. And in Tarkist topological semantics of model, logic openness actually aligns with necessity and impossibility. So again, freedom is the boundary. Therefore, freedom is about navigating doubt, uncertainty, and risk. Closure thus becomes this very mindful and intentional process, which is the act of contouring, not achieving an endpoint, right? By delineating boundaries. So that's the topological understanding of freedom. And what does this mean? It means that a world without contours isn't free, and that without a sense of closure, we can't exercise free choice. In life and art becomes, obvious because it's acknowledging some boundaries, some established boundaries, and then break them. Uh, we touched on this in the conversation I had with Vieira for mortality. So social political regulations, inner self-regulation, conceptual refinement, democracies, they are all inconceivable without this kind of active contouring. So here's something I keep thinking about. Do humans experience freedom because our lives are inevitably organized, delimited, and refined by the ultimate boundary, which is death? And even without getting into theories, we can feel our excitement for life coming from this mixed suspense. When love brushes up against hate, when life dances on the edge of death, that's when we feel alive. How about our daily, limitless digital landscape, where all boundaries fade into unboundedness and everything becomes a seamless accumulation when we are online, because digital worlds never adjust in the face of contingency, right? They just become larger and larger, which makes contouring, meaning the right nuanced choices, impossible. So can digital openness ever accommodate freedom? Digital life is not even that different from digital death after all. They're just this wide open thing that only grows. Perhaps that's why digital environment fosters fundamentalism and polarization. Instagram stories, shorts, YouTube shorts resume complex narratives in a sentence and a few frames, and it's not even their inaccuracy, sorry, that's problematic, but their inadequacy in the face of human complexity. And now some conclusions, very briefly. There are 6 things I'd like to stress and hopefully to encourage further exploration. First, I didn't explore the moral dimension of closure: forgiveness, responsibility, remorse, resentment. After a death, moral urgency often compels us to seek evidence to get our story right. And this, I think, needs attention. Then, as I said, closure is probably tied to our understanding of time. Then, agency is also very much implied in the act of contouring. But agentless closure can happen. Life in time and space simply causes things to fade. And Paul Ricoeur beautifully addresses forgetting, and this also needs further discussion. And finally, my 2 takeaway ideas: all loss defies closure, yet all loss craves it. And that closure is not about concluding, it's about contouring. Again, what was the point of this presentation? No one stays open or closed to experiences for a definite time, because the human mind simply doesn't work that way. On the other hand, persistent indefiniteness can't be a good thing, right? So by viewing closure as contouring, we can create this sense of freedom. We can carve our path to grief by navigating uncertainty, ambivalence. And the issue with grief models lies not in their correctness, but in their totalitarian nature, which can become oppressive. So if we see this boundary experience of grief as a rope walking, we recognize the dynamic tension between pursuing completion and yearning for openness. And then we understand that we can't reduce one to another. So, understanding closure as contouring is really about learning how not to reduce one realm of life to another. And this is a principle central to grief, to rituals, to artistic endeavors, and to life in general. Thank you for your patience and for your interest. I'll gladly answer all your questions. I think in a week or so I'll be able to. Thank you again.